Welcome to Staffworks Explained. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. In this video, we'll be talking about the Dangote Refinery. The announcement has been made. It's now Lamu and not Mombasa. So we're going to tell the story, which we say is bigger than Kenya. For months, the question was never whether Aliko Dangote wanted to build an oil refinery in East Africa. The real question was where. Mombasa appeared to be the obvious choice. It is East Africa's busiest seaport, already serves as the region petroleum gateway, and possesses decades of experience handling imported crude and refined fuel. Yet, in a development that has surprised many within the energy industry, Dangote Industries has now identified Lamu as the preferred location for its proposed East Africa refinery. If completed, the project would fundamentally reshape the region's energy landscape. It would alter fuel supply chains stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Great Lakes, influence investment decisions in several countries, Uganda, Tanzania, South Sudan, and also potentially revive Kenya's own oil ambition in Turkana, and place Lamu at the center of one of the Africa's most strategically important industrial investment. Here, we examine what has actually been announced, what remains uncertain, why Lamu appears to have overtaken Mombasa, and whether broader regional consideration, including the long-term prospects of oil exploration off the Horn of Africa, may have influenced that decision. One point deserves to be made from the outset. While headlines have declared that the refinery is coming to Lamu, that is not the same thing as saying construction is guaranteed. According to Reuters, Dangote Industries has confirmed that it has selected a site in Lamu, with soil investigation already underway, as well as engineering and design work having started. The company says the refinery will be financed through a combination of internally generated funds, bond financing, and proceeds from a planned public listing of Dangote Petroleum Refinery. Reuters further reports that construction could take approximately 3 years once the project proceeds. Those are significant milestones, but they do not amount to final investment decisions or commencement of full-scale construction. That distinction is important. Large industrial projects of this scale pass through several gateways before becoming reality. Site selection is only one of them. Environmental approvals, land acquisition, detailed engineering, financing, procurement of equipment, government licenses, and commercial agreements all have to fall in place before heavy construction starts. Anyone familiar with mega projects knows that many ambitious projects never progress beyond the planning stage, while others undergo significant design before the first foundation is laid. And this is not different for Dangote Refinery. So one question that people are asking, is Lamu confirmed? We can say that yes, based on the company's own public statement, Lamu is now the identified location for proposed refinery. Another question that is being asked is it certain that the refinery will ultimately be built there? We say no. The project remains a proposal until the remaining commercial, regulatory, financial hurdles are cleared. This is an important distinction, particularly given the size of the investment that we are talking about here. So, many expected Mombasa. The choice of Lamu has surprised many observers because, on paper, Mombasa city appeared to offer almost every advantage an investor would seek. The city already functions as East Africa's primary petroleum import hub. The Kenya Pipeline Company infrastructure originates from here. Fuel storage capacity is extensive. Shipping routes are well established and distribution networks serving Uganda, Rwanda, South Sudan, eastern DRC, and parts of Tanzania already depend heavily on the port. Industry analysts had therefore assumed that locating a refinery in the city would reduce capital expenditure by allowing developers to leverage existing infrastructure instead of building much of it from scratch. Earlier this year, reporting from the Financial Times, later confirmed through Reuters, suggested Dangote himself had favored Mombasa over Tanzania port of Tanga because of Kenya's larger economy, strong domestic fuel demand, as well as superior commercial prospects. At that stage, Mombasa was widely viewed as the front runner. From a logistics standpoint, the argument was compelling. Crude oil could arrive through an established deep water port. Refined products could immediately feed into the existing pipeline system. Skilled labor supporting industries as well as experienced port operators were already available. Every one of these factors typically reduces both project risk and construction, which raises an obvious question: why move north to Lamu? Now, why did Lamu win? Dangote Industries has not published a detailed technical evaluation explaining why Lamu was ultimately selected. However, several factors point to why the destination may make strategic sense over the long term. The first is geography. Unlike Mombasa, Lamu sits at the center of Kenya's long-term infrastructure vision through Lamu Port South Sudan Ethiopia Transport Corridor, better known as LAPSSET. Conceived as one of Africa's largest infrastructure programs, LAPSSET was designed to transform the northern Kenya into logistics and industrial corridor, linking Kenya with Ethiopia, South Sudan, and eventually the wider region. A refinery of this magnitude fits naturally into that vision. Secondly, Lamu offers room for expansion. Modern refineries are no longer simply fuel processing plants. They often evolve into integrated industrial complexes, housing petrochemical facilities, fertilizer plants, storage terminals, export jetties, power generation units, as well as manufacturing industry that rely on petroleum byproducts, among other things. Such developments require enormous tracts of land, something increasingly difficult to secure around a densely developed Mombasa metropolitan area. There is also the maritime decision. Lamu positions itself along the northern Kenya coastline, and this place is closer to the emerging shipping routes serving the Horn of Africa, as well as the wider Western Indian Ocean. That geography may become increasingly valuable as trade patterns evolve over the coming decades. And now, there is also the Somalia factor, where now we separate facts from what has been speculated. No discussion about Lamu's strategic importance is complete without mentioning Somalia. There has been considerable speculations within regional energy circles that the northern Kenya coast could eventually become an important processing and export point not only for Kenyan crude, but potentially for oil produced elsewhere in the region. Somalia has attracted growing international interest following offshore licensing rounds and reduced exploration activity. Successful geological assessment have suggested that both offshore and some onshore basins could contain significant hydrocarbon resources, although commercially recoverable reserves have not yet been fully established through production. Several international energy companies have expressed interest in exploration blocks as security conditions gradually improve in the region. Another important element is the long-running maritime boundary dispute between Kenya and Somalia. For years, the two countries disagreed over ownership of a triangular section of the Indian Ocean believed to hold offshore oil and gas potential. Somalia took the dispute to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which in 2021 largely ruled in Somalia's favor by redrawing the maritime boundary. Kenya rejected the judgment, maintaining that the court lacked jurisdictions and that the decision would not be recognized domestically. It is important to distinguish verified facts from industry speculation. There is no public evidence that Dangote Industries has started its or intends to build Lamu refinery specifically to process Somali crude. However, many energy analysts believe any investor committing tens of billions of dollars to a refinery would naturally consider the widest possible future supply base. A refinery located in Lamu would sit within reach not only for the imported Middle Eastern crude and Kenya-owned potential production, but also any commercially viable production that could eventually emerge from Somalia and other countries bordering the Western Indian Ocean. Whether that possibility influenced the choice of Lamu remains unconfirmed. It is also plausible commercial consideration, not an established fact. What is beyond dispute is that the refinery location places it closer to some of East Africa's most prospective frontier oil provinces. That would have been the case had it not been built further south. Next, we'll examine what a 700,000 barrels a day refinery actually means in practical terms, compare it with Africa's largest refineries, as well as analyze how it could affect Uganda's refinery, Tanzania energy ambitions, and Kenya's Turkana oil project. Let's start by understanding the scale. What does a 700,000 barrel per day refinery actually mean? Numbers in the oil industries can be deceptive. A refinery designed to process 700,000 barrels of crude oil every day is not simply a large industrial plant. It belongs to a category of infrastructure that can redefine an entire region's economy. To put that into perspective, one barrel contains approximately 159 liters of crude oil. Processing 700,000 barrels every day means handling more than 100 million liters of crude before it is transformed into petrol, diesel, jet fuel, liquefied petroleum gas (LPG), marine fuels, bitumen, and other petrochemical products or petroleum products. Over a full year, assuming continuous operation, such a refinery would process more than 255 million barrels of crude oil. Fewer facilities anywhere in the world operate at their full nameplate capacity every day due to scheduled maintenance, market conditions, as well as operational adjustment. But the figure illustrates the sheer scale of proposed investment. More importantly, a refinery does not convert every barrel into one product. Modern refineries maximize value by separating crude oil into multiple streams, depending on the type of crude being processed and the sophistication of the refinery. The largest share typically becomes diesel and petrol, while significant volumes are also converted into aviation fuel, LPG, heavy fuel oil, petrochemical feedstocks, lubricants, as well as asphalt. That diversity allows operators to respond to changing market demand and improve profitability. For ordinary consumers, the significance is straightforward. A refinery of this size could produce enough fuel to supply several countries simultaneously, rather than serving Kenya only, the domestic market. That is why analysts see the proposal not as a Kenyan refinery, but as a regional hub, energy hub. How would it compare with other African countries? If built at the announced capacity, the proposed Lamu refinery would immediately rank among the largest in Africa. Nigeria's Dangote Petroleum Refinery, which was commissioned in Lagos, was designed with processing capacity of about 650 barrels per day and is currently the continent's largest operating refinery. The proposed Kenya facility at 700,000 barrels per day would therefore exceed this refinery on paper. The comparison is striking because the Lagos refinery was itself regarded as once-in-a-generation industrial project. It took several years to construct, It required billions of dollars in investment and involved one of the most complex privately financed infrastructure programs ever undertaken in Africa. Elsewhere on the continent, most refineries are significantly smaller. South Africa's refining sector has historically consisted of several medium-sized facilities rather than a single mega refinery. Egypt operates multiple refineries serving both domestic consumption as well as export market, while Angola has recently commissioned the Cabinda refinery and is expanding the refinery capacity through additional projects. None individually approaches the scale that is being proposed for Lamu. In East Africa, the contrast is even more pronounced. Kenya's former refinery at Changamwe in Mombasa, once operated by the Kenya Petroleum Refineries Limited, had a capacity of roughly 90,000 barrels per day before refining operations halted in 2013. Tanzania has no refinery of comparable scale, while Uganda is still pursuing plans for its domestic refinery. In other words, the proposed Lamu project would not simply be another refinery. It would represent a dramatic shift in East Africa's refining capacity. Why capacity matters beyond Kenya? Refineries operate most efficiently when they serve large markets. Kenya alone is unlikely to consume the full output of 700,000 barrels per day refinery. The commercial logic therefore depends on supplying neighboring countries while also exporting refined products beyond the region. East Africa has long relied on imported petroleum products. Despite growing energy demand, large volumes of refined fuel arrive from the Middle East, India, and increasingly other international suppliers before being distributed inland through ports, pipelines, and road transport. A refinery capable of processing hundreds of thousands of barrels every day could alter that equation. Instead of importing finished petrol or diesel, countries could export or import crude oil or rely on regional crude production and refine it within East Africa before distributing the finished product across the region. That shortens supply chains, and also reduces exposure to disruptions affecting international refining centers, and under favorable market conditions can lower logistics cost. Whether consumers ultimately see lower pump prices, that would depend on several variables, including crude oil prices, taxes, exchange rate, transport costs, as well as government policy. A local refinery does not automatically guarantee cheaper fuel, and that's something that people should note. What does this mean for Uganda, this refinery in Lamu? Perhaps no country will watch this proposal more closely than Uganda. Uganda has spent years preparing to develop its own refinery alongside commercial productions from the Albertine regions, Graben oil fields. The country's strategy has been clear: extract crude oil, refine part of that domestically to improve energy security, and export the remainder through the East African Crude Oil Pipeline (EACOP) raced through Tanzania. The planned Uganda refinery has been designed with an initial capacity of about 60,000 barrels per day, with room for future expansion. This is intended to primarily satisfy Uganda domestic fuel requirements rather than compete directly in international export markets. A 700,000 barrels per day refinery in Kenya would inevitably change that competitive landscape. The difference in scale is substantial. The proposed Dangote facility would be more than 10 times larger than the Uganda initial refinery design. That does not necessarily make Uganda projects obsolete. The two projects are based on different objectives. Uganda's refinery is closely linked to national energy security. Its aim is to guarantee domestic fuel supplies, create value from Uganda's own crude production, as well as reduce dependence on imported refined products. The proposed refinery, by contrast, would operate as a regional commercial hub, relying on economies of scale. In simple terms, a larger refinery becomes, the larger a refinery becomes, the lower its average processing cost can be, provided It operates at high utilization rates and secures reliable crude supplies. This creates an interesting policy question for Uganda. Should the country continue investing heavily in refining its own crude oil domestically, or could importing a competitively priced refined product from a nearby mega refinery eventually prove more economical? That debate is likely to intensify if Lamu project progresses beyond planning. However, Uganda possesses one significant advantage that Kenya does not currently enjoy. It has confirmed commercially recoverable crude oil reserves ready for production once supporting infrastructure is completed, and that is happening soon. That provides a secure domestic source of feedstock for its planned refinery. Now let's look at Tanzania's position. Tanzania may view this development through a different lens. Although it has discussed refinery projects over the years, its immediate energy priorities have centered more on natural gas development and the export of crude from neighboring Uganda through the East African Crude Oil Pipeline (EACOP). The emergence of a major refinery in Lamu would create both competition and opportunity. On one hand, Kenya could strengthen its position as a East African principal fuel processing and distribution center. On the other, regional demand for refined products continues to grow rapidly as populations expand, vehicle ownership increases, industrialization accelerates. It is therefore conceivable that multiple refining centers could coexist if demand keeps pace within economic growth. Rather than replacing every planned investment elsewhere, the proposed refinery could encourage greater integration of region energy market, with countries specializing in different parts of petroleum value chain. And what about Kenya's own oil? The proposed refinery also revives an important question that has lingered for nearly over a decade. What happens to Kenya oil discovered in Turkana? Commercial discoveries by Taro Oil and its partners generated considerable optimism during the last decade, raising hopes that Kenya would become an oil-producing country soon. Pilot exports demonstrated that crude from the South Lokicha Basin could reach international market. However, full-scale development has repeatedly stalled because of financing challenges, disagreement over project economics, as well as uncertainty surrounding infrastructure required to transport crude from the remote oil fields to the coast for export. A refinery in Lamu has the potential to change that part of calculation. Instead of viewing Turkana crude solely as an export commodity, Kenya could eventually have the option of processing some of these domestically or even all domestically, depending on the quality of the crude and commercial configuration of the refinery. That would create additional flexibility for future oil development. Even so, the refinery alone would not solve the challenges that are facing the Turkana oil. Oil must still be produced economically, transported efficiently over hundreds of kilometers, and supplied within a commercial viable agreement. These decisions remain separate investment cases requiring their own financing, regulatory approvals, as well as market conditions. The refinery could become an important destination for crude oil from Kenya, but only if the upstream oil project itself finally moves from promise to production. Next, we'll examine the project through the lens of execution rather than just a vision. How much a refinery of this magnitude is likely to cost, whether the 3-year construction timeline is realistic, the regulatory and financial hurdles that are ahead, the environmental and security concerns in Lamu, as well as potential political opposition, and what milestones investors and governments will be watching before the project can move from announcement to reality. That's the road from announcement to reality. Let's have a look at that. The major infrastructure projects are rarely defined by the day they are announced. They are defined by what happens afterwards. For the proposed Dangote Refinery in Lamu, the coming months will determine whether the project gathers momentum or joins a long list of ambitious development that struggle to move from planning and beyond. From a project delivery perspective, several milestones must still be achieved before construction can begin in earnest. The first is the completion of a detailed engineering studies. While preliminary engineering and site investigation may have already started, developers must still determine final configuration of the refinery, its storage facilities, marine infrastructure, utilities, pipelines, as well as associated industrial installations. Environmental and social impact assessment will also be central to the project future. Under Kenyan law, projects of this scale are required to do an extensive environmental review before receiving any approval. That process goes beyond assessing ecological impacts. It also examines how local communities, fisheries, tourism, cultural heritage, and livelihoods can be affected. Public participation is another critical stage. Communities living around the proposed development area are entitled to review the project plans, submit their own views before licenses are issued. For a project occupying a significant land area, as well as operating for decades, community acceptance can become just as important as the engineering capability. Only after these stages are completed can developers proceed to major procurement, where they award construction contracts as well as mobilize heavy equipment. Let's now look at the timeline. Is 3-year construction timeline realistic? Dangote Industries has indicated that construction could take 3 years or such kind of a figure. Whether that target is achievable depends on when the clock starts. If measured from the commencement of a physical construction, after all the approvals have been secured, 3 years is ambitious, but not impossible for a large refinery delivered by an experienced developer with reliable financing and well-managed contractors. If, however, the timelines include permitting, land acquisition, financing, detailed engineering and procurement, industry experience suggests that the overall program is likely to take considerably longer. Large refineries rank among the most technically demanding industrial facilities in the world. Thousands of workers may be required during peak constructions. Billion engineering hours go into designing process units capable of operating safely under extreme high temperatures and constraints. Specialist equipment, including reactors, distillation columns, as well as compressors, which is often manufactured in different countries before being transported by sea and assembled on site. Any delays in financing, equipment delivery, environmental approval, or contractor mobilization can quickly affect the overall schedule. The experience of the Dangote Refinery in Lagos clearly shows that this is the reality. Although the project was ultimately completed, it experienced several revisions to its original schedule before commencing operations. That is not unusual for projects of this complexity. A realistic expectation, therefore, is that the journey from announcement to full commercial operations could extend well beyond the 3 years, depending on how quickly approvals, financing, and construction progresses. What could stand in the way of this project? And there are several things. The opportunities are considerable, but are also the risks. Financing remains one of the biggest. Although Dangote Industries has outlined the plans to fund the refinery through internal sources, bond financing, and proceeds from future public listing, raising capital for a project of this magnitude will depend on market conditions, investor confidence, as well as confidence in the project's commercial viability. The final investment cost has not been publicly disclosed. However, Comparison with similarly sized refineries suggests the investment could run into many billions of dollars. For context, the Dangote Refinery in Lagos required an estimated investment of around 20 billion US dollars, making it one of the Africa's most expensive privately financed industrial projects. It would be premature to assume the Kenyan's refinery will cost the same, as every project has different engineering requirements, infrastructure needs, as well as financing structure. Even so, few expect the investment to be anything other than one of the largest ever proposed in East Africa. Security will also attract attention. Lamu occupies a strategically important positions along Kenya's northern coastline and has at times experienced security challenges linked to the attacks by the Somalia-based militant group Al-Shabaab. The Kenya government has invested heavily in strengthening security in this area around Lamu Port and the broader Lapsset corridor. But any investor considering long-term infrastructure of this scale will continue to evaluate security risks alongside commercial consideration. Then there is environmental question. Lamu is internationally recognized for its rich biodiversity, sensitive coastal ecosystems, and cultural heritage. Conservation organizations have historically raised concerns about large-scale industrial developments in the area, arguing that they could affect marine habitats, mangrove forests, fisheries, and tourism if not carefully managed. Those concerns do not necessarily prevent development, but they can influence project design, approval conditions, as well as implementation timelines. Could there be political opposition? Large infrastructure projects inevitably attract competing interests. Some opposition may come from communities seeking greater clarity on compensation, employment opportunities, as well as environmental safeguards. Others may question whether sufficient public infrastructure should be committed to support a privately developed refinery. There is also the regional dimension. Although Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania cooperate extensively through the East African community, they also compete to attract strategic investment. A refinery capable of becoming East African dominant processing hub would inevitably reshape commercial relationships across the region. Government pursuing their own refining ambitions will closely monitor developments, particularly if investment decisions begin influencing fuel trade patterns. That competition, however, should not be viewed solely as a source of conflict. Growing regional demand means that there is a room for greater cooperation through shared infrastructure, cross-border pipelines, storage facilities, petroleum trading arrangements. The extent to which that happens will depend as much on political will as on market forces. So what should happen next? For investors, policymakers, as well as industry observers, the next indicators are likely to be more important than the announcement itself. Attention will turn to the completion of environmental studies, confirmation of financing arrangements, publication of detailed engineering plans, government approvals, and ultimately a final investment decision by Dangote Industries. Only once those milestones are achieved will the market begin treating the refinery as an active construction project rather than a proposed development. Until then, caution remains appropriate. And now to make a conclusion, where we say that it's a decision that could reshape East Africa. Whether or not first concrete is poured in Lamu within the next few years, one thing has already changed. That is the conversation. For decades, East Africa has largely occupied the downstream end of global petroleum industry, importing refined fuels while exporting little value in return. The proposed Dangote Refinery challenges that model by envisioning the region not simply as a consumer of petroleum products, but as a major refining as well as distribution center. Selecting Lamu over Mombasa has surprised many because the latter appeared to offer the stronger immediate commercial case. Yet, infrastructure projects of this scale are rarely driven by today's logistics only. They are shaped by expectation of where trade, production, and regional demand will be decades from now. There is still a considerable distance between selecting a site and commissioning a refinery capable of processing 700,000 barrels of crude every day. Financing must be secured, environmental approvals must be obtained, communities must engage, engineering plans must be translated into steel, concrete, and pipelines. Only then will the project move from concept to reality. If those hurdles are overcome, the implication will extend far beyond Kenyan coastline. Uganda's refining strategy will be reassessed. Tanzania's role within the regional energy market will also evolve. Kenya's long delayed Turkana oil project could acquire renewed commercial significance. Even future hydrocarbon discoveries elsewhere in the western Indian Ocean could eventually find a processing hub on the shores of Lamu. For now, however, the most accurate description is also the simplest. Lamu is the proposed home of what could become one of Africa's largest oil refineries. The location has been identified. The ambition is unmistakable. But the refinery itself remains a project that must still earn its place on the ground. So thank you for reaching this far. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. You can watch other videos that we have made on this topic and other projects across Africa. So thank you, and let's meet in the next one.